Hello, this is Dread, and in today's video topic, we are going to be doing a little bit something different this time around. So I was perusing the forums for Last Epoch, and I saw this post about corruption and average corruption that builds should be pushing, and this is actually a topic that a lot of people have been talking about in the community of late because of the rework to corruption, and I thought that I would weigh in my opinions on it. But before we do that, first off, I would heavily suggest leaving a like on the video and subscribing to the channel if you like videos like this one. And with all that being said, let's actually listen to Mike and what Mike thinks about the question here, shall we?
Or not if it doesn't. Any thoughts on raising the corruption level expectation for classes from 300 to 600? I think something may have got lost in translation there. I think what I said was a build is I consider a build successful if it can do 300 corruption. Um, and it's just a number really. So like, it doesn't really matter what that number is. I don't think. Is that like there's it's kind of hard to explain, I guess, but maybe it's not hard. The like you've got the number that is the corruption, and how difficult that number is just some arbitrary setting we've created. Uh, so like maybe you just want us to crank the difficulty of corruption up instead.
So to go more into detail of this poster's specific posting, he said, so I asked a question to Mike about the expectation of a build being able to hit 300 corruption and potentially raising that expectation to 600 corruption. Based on how Mike answered, the 300 corruption bar isn't a hard line the devs use to balance builds. If I'm hearing correctly, then Mike uses 300 corruption as a ballpark figure to gauge for the build success, which may vary from dev to dev within the team. Maybe I heard the answer wrong, but what is everyone's thoughts on this? The reason I'm bringing this up is because I've heard from many other players that the target corruption level for the game is balanced around 300 corruption. So there's a few things for this. First things off, the first thing that we heard when we talked about, so like for instance, I actually specifically asked Mike on this. We were talking about deep corruption. So if you don't know, in the prior patch, corruption was significantly different. 1000 corruption was significantly different than it is now in multiple different ways, mainly in terms of the variability of difficulty. 1000 corruption with these specific mods versus those specific mods could have been completely different in terms of difficulty. So there were certain mods like void enemies deal 400% increased damage and stuff like that in the pool. And we asked the devs like, hey, are you guys going to balance high corruption, right? Are you going to balance high corruption? They're like, no, we're not going to balance high corruption, right? That was the main response. And part of that response was talking about how like they usually balance the game around like 300 corruption. That's like where this came from. This is where the misconception came from. We were simply asking like, hey, are you guys going to balance higher difficulty mods because they get kind of absurd in higher levels, which they finally did, by the way, by reworking corruption. So let's talk about that. So since they reworked corruption in general is completely different than what it was before. It is a completely different standard and should be generally thought differently as such. So I have actually prepared two different characters right now. So I have two different characters. I have a sorcerer and I have a warlock. Now, this sorcerer here, right, was in patch 9.2 right before 1.0 in the change to corruption, okay? And then we have the Warlock here, which is in version 1.01, which is when I was playing in Merchant's Guild and I was buying gear and I was playing this Warlock instead. Now, the reason why I brought up both of these builds is because they're essentially the same build, just with different, like they have the same defensive thing based around Vessel of Strife, right? So, it's a Vessel of Strife build, health regen, gained as ward, stuff like that. And then, of course, the Warlock, same thing, health regen, gained as ward, right? Same kind of concept for the defensive layers, which is what we're going to get at here. So this character, this sorcerer, was going through completely different pressures than this character here, right? This warlock. So I'm going to pull up some footage here real quick, and we're going to talk about it a little bit more here in detail. All right, so here is a recording of my sorcerer character in the previous patch, patch 9.2, as you can see in the upper left, and we were around, I think, like 600 corruption at the time. So the first thing that you'll notice is on the right side here, you'll see that enemies have 253% more health and damage. In the current patch, that would be well over, I think, 500% more health and damage if it was the new corruption scaling. But another thing that you'll notice, you will see the other numbers. High health enemies deal 100% increased damage, high health enemies deal 100% increased damage. What does this mean? This means that these enemies are essentially doing about, I think, 3 times as much damage as they normally would be at this corruption, as long as they're high health. This makes the corruption in the old system way more variable in difficulty than it was before. All of a sudden, if I get them below high health, all of a sudden they deal significantly less damage. As you can tell, it only took one mod to cap my glancing blow, as you can tell, right? It only took one mod here to cap my glancing blow. It took one mod to get my enemies to have 60% endurance. So the base number was significantly lower, but these numbers were significantly higher. And corruption back then was kind of way easier than it was now. So corruption back then was significantly easier, okay? This means that, like, you know, like for instance, if all you gotta do is to make sure you don't pick a bunch of crazy mods in a row, then all of a sudden all your bosses and all your, like, so for instance, if I was to do a boss on this character, right, I would make sure that he does not have high health enemies deal increased damage or endurance or glancing blow, because through the way that the monolith system works, I could abuse it to the point where I could do bosses without any modifiers on them, meaning that a 600 corruption boss is only 253% more health and damage, which is about half of what it currently is in the current system, right? So for instance, if I were to do a boss with no modifiers in the new corruption, it would be like 600% more health and damage. While if I were to do a boss in this system, they would only have 253% more health and damage. So corruption was technically significantly easier last patch, as long as you were doing it properly, of course, right? Now, the thing is, the variability of difficulty, though, was much higher. Like the potential for much higher difficulty, as you can see, right, with these modifiers, you could get absolutely ridiculous. Like void enemies deal 5,000% increased damage. Obviously, that's a hyperbole, but still, right? So let's look at the Ignite Warlock, shall we? All right, so now this is my Ignite Warlock character around, I think, like 700 corruption, if I'm not mistaken. I can't remember the exact numbers, but as you can tell, it is a completely different situation. We went from 250% more health and damage to 700% more health and damage, but this is around the same amount of corruption that we had as last patch as that sorcerer build. It's like in the same ballpark. But as you can tell, the modifiers on the side there, enemies deal 20% increased damage, enemies have 30% endurance. Like the endurance doesn't even cap with one modifier, right? And we also have significantly less modifiers. We only have 3, while in the old system you can get like 5 or 6 if I'm not mistaken. So like the difficulty in this patch on average went up significantly. It's no longer as variable, but the average of difficulty went up significantly. 600 corruption now versus 600 corruption then is 2 completely different ballparks, 2 completely different modifiers. So like for instance, if you get to 700 to 600 to 700 corruption in this patch versus last patch, your build is significantly better than it was last patch. That is because the bosses that you're fighting, like the end game bosses, like, you know, like Oribus and stuff like that, you can't cheese them like you could in the old system. Because in the old system, I could just delete the modifiers through utilizing the game mechanics, and then all of a sudden my boss only has 250% more health and damage. Well, if I were to do that with here, I would have a boss in Oribus with 700% more health and damage, meaning that the Oribuses and the bosses in this patch are significantly harder and have significant more health and damage than they did last patch. And that's mainly what the corruption system did, was it made bosses actually matter. And, you know, they actually have HP and stuff like that. So you have to actually deal with their mechanics and stuff like that. So that's what the corruption system did. It did not change too much. It just made it so that the average of your gameplay experience is the same across the board instead of it being absolutely ridiculous like it was before, where you could have a monolith that was 20 times more difficult than the average for no reason other than, oh, oops, I accidentally put deadly plus high health enemies deal 5,000% increased damage, yada, yada, yada. Obviously, this is hyperbole, but still, like, the difference here to take away from this, right, if we're to TLDR it, is the average difficulty of these monoliths are significantly higher, but their like the high end of difficulty is significantly lower. So it is a balanced experience now, and 600 700 corruption is significantly more difficult than it was last patch. Now there's something else I want to point out as well while we're here. So if we were to go back to the planners that I was talking about, so we have this sorcerer here. Let's look over his gear, right? Now, last patch, a Dragoner's Claw with T6 melee attack speed was a very hard thing to get. Now, of course, like, if you kept grinding and kept grinding, you'd eventually have a Dragoras with T6 attack speed, right? But, like it would take a while. If you had this, I would look at it and be like, wow, damn, he farmed a lot, right? And then if we were to look at some other items here, a decent helmet, intelligence, health regen, health regen. The other prefix is useless, but that's fine, because back in the day, you didn't really need it. The amulet here, crit, increased area, shred, health regen. This actually is like an okay amulet, but that could have been spell crit. It'd been much better if it was spell crit, right? The offhand here, this is actually a pretty good offhand. This is actually one of the better items on my character, right? Although we could have had crit multi, but it's fine. The chest here is kind of mediocre. The last suffix is kind of worthless, so you'd rather have percent armor, but whatever, right? It's good enough. My belt only has 1 LP. It's not max rolled. It has 38% poison res on it, so it's like even a vanilla belt would probably be better than this if it rolled better, right? And then the gloves here, we don't even have like exalted attack speed on these, right? We just have health regen, frailty. Like if you like, this should have attack speed on it, right? And it would be much better movement speed here. These boots are actually pretty good. They're just on the wrong base, right? And my Vessel Strife has like a pretty decent health regen roll on it. And this is what I would say a pretty geared up character last patch. This is like pretty damn geared up for last patch. Like this is like more than what your average player would grind towards and get. But let's look at my Warlock for a little bit here, right? So this is the Warlock in Merchant's Guild, right? So we have access to Merchant's Guild, the ability to buy items. So let's look over the gear a little bit here. So my helmet here, oh my god, it has +2 to Hungering Souls, like the int, the health regen, the phys res, all on the right base, right? That's really good. The amulet here, as you can see, it's a very drastic difference between the amulets. I have a double T6 amulet with a T1 sealed frailty with good percent rolls on the implicits, while also having everything that I would want on the amulet. And like, just to compare, like, that's a huge difference, right? Here, my weapon is 4 LP. Now, of course, for this would be like, you could get like a 2 LP Dragoras pretty cheap in trade right now. So I'd say like a 2 LP Dragoras is the same level as like a 4 LP Fire Starter's Torch, right? This Fire Starter's Torch is slammed with double tier 6, right? This chest here, the health regen, like it has health regen, armor percent int, +2, like it's on the perfect base. Like it's beautiful, right? The shield here, this shield last patch would have been an icon. It like would have been one of the best items in your collection. And right now I feel like as though it wasn't the best item for what I was doing, but like this is insane, right? In normal circumstances, this would have been insane last patch. And then like this belt here, 3 LP Azraels didn't exist. 2 LP ones existed maybe, and maybe 2 LP with the right mods, who knows, right? And then you have like Malins with 2 LP. Malins with 2 LP just didn't exist back in the day, right? Like you could get them eventually, but getting 2 LP Malins with the modifiers that you wanted on them, like wow, like holy crap. And speaking of that, fiery dragon shoes with the best in slot modifiers on them, like what the hell? Like this would have been crazy last patch, right? And then like the Vessel of Strife here with T6 health regen, this would take a while. Then like look at her idols here, best in slot idol. Hey, look at that, best in slot idol. like, and then, you know, capture resistances across the board and stuff like that. And what I'm trying to get at is the game may have gotten significantly more difficult, as you can tell, between last patch and this patch. But not only that, the gearing requirements in MG have multiplied our character power by multiple like magnitudes, to the point where 600, 700 corruption is like what it felt like 300 corruption back in the day, right? Because of the difference in power level in terms of gearing, right? At least in Merchant's Guild. In COF, it's a little bit less different. Like, I'll be honest, in COF, this is like a little bit more acceptable, but in Merchant's Guild, this gear would have been laughed at, right? Because like there's so much better gear you could have than this, right? Like, you could do much better, as we can tell now. Like, look at the difference in health regen. Look, 788 health regen versus 14, almost 1300 health regen, like double the movement speed. Like, look at the armor difference, like 3300 versus 1100. Like, dude, like, it's not even comparable between last patch and this patch in terms of power level. So the game may have gotten more difficult, but also as well, the gearing that we have access to has gotten so much better that we could probably have done like 4,000 corruption in the last patch instead of just like 1,000. So yeah, with all that being said, this has been Jed. I thought I'd put in my shoe. This is why people are talking about like, hey, it should probably be around like 600 corruption now, because that's like where the average is for most people, at least in Merchant's Guild. Now, one thing I will state, the average for Merchant's Guild and the average for COF are two completely different ballparks. As someone who has now played COF recently and has played Merchant's Guild, I've played both of them and saw both sides of the, you know, of the coin here. I believe that Merchant's Guild is significantly better in terms of how far you can push a random character. Now, with all that being said, this has been Dread. Off to go do something else. Bye.